slow, low voice, the kind that makes you lean closer to the screen. There's a file in the Charleston archives that isn't supposed to exist. A sealed record marked, Property Loss, Greyfield Estate, 1716. No digital copy, no public mention. Only a line in a 200-year-old inventory book and a blank page glued shut. But if you peel that page open, if you dare, you'll find 14 names. The richest men in Colonial, South Carolina. All declared dead on the same night. The cause? Thermal immolation of uncertain origin. But the handwriting changes on that line. It's as if someone else finished the record, hurriedly, shakily, and beside it, written in Portuguese in ink that still bleeds when touched by humidity, there's a single phrase: A justiça queima mais devagar que o carvão. Justice burns slower than coal. That was the only sentence ever spoken by the woman found at the scene, Esperanza de Lima. When the sheriff's men arrived 3 days later, they found her sitting by the furnace, hands folded, eyes calm. Around her, the air still reeked of burnt iron and human fat. They said she had been sharpening kitchen knives and humming a lullaby, the same melody slaves used to sing when children were taken from their mothers and sold upriver. Authorities tried to erase her story, sealing the records under the order of Governor Robert Johnson, but fragments survived: court logs, shipping manifests, and a single parish ledger entry noting a Portuguese Negro woman detained for witchcraft. She was never tried, never executed, never even seen again. But men whispered that her name cursed every field along the Ashley River, that the coal furnace at Greyfield burned on its own for 7 nights, even after the ashes were cleared. Tonight, we open that sealed page. We pull the thread that history buried under centuries of polite lies, and you will see that the Greyfield Massacre wasn't an act of madness. It was a calculated message, encoded vengeance, born from a system that mistook silence for obedience. Because Esperanza de Lima didn't just burn her masters alive, she exposed the machinery of empire and the psychological system that still runs in shadows today. Pause. A faint echo of the lullaby hums under the voice. Let's begin. Before she was a slave, before she was a name in a ledger, Esperanza de Lima was something far older than empire. She was born on the western coast of Angola, beneath a blood-colored moon, during what her people called the Night of Masks, when spirits were said to walk among the living, choosing their instruments of balance. Her father was a village chief, a strategist, a man who understood that every system of power hides behind ceremony and language. Her mother was a healer, a woman who whispered to roots and stones as if they were listening. They said Esperanza was different from the moment she opened her eyes. She didn't cry, she only stared, silently, deeply, as if she was already trying to remember. By 12, she could recite ancestral lineages backward, a feat meant to confuse malevolent spirits. By 16, she could calm fevers with a mixture of herbs unknown to Portuguese doctors, and by 18, she could read a man's intent from the rhythm of his heartbeat. But none of that mattered when the ships came. In 1701, the Portuguese raiders burned her village, slaughtered her kin, and dragged the survivors to the coast. Esperanza watched her father crucified on a wooden gate for refusing to kneel. She didn't scream, she just watched, and remembered the names of the men who held the torches. On the ship Santa Maria, she learned the first rule of domination. To own a body, you must first break the mind. The traders called it seasoning, starvation, isolation, sensory control, designed to erase identity. But Esperanza did something no overseer understood. She let them think she was breaking. She mirrored their expectations, the bowed head, the trembling obedience. Inside, she mapped their rituals of control, every command, every humiliation, every fear they relied on to keep others docile. By the time the ship docked in Charleston, she wasn't a Vic, Tim anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting back the sickness of empire with perfect stillness. And the man who bought her, Edmund Greyfield, didn't purchase a slave that day. He purchased his executioner, because Esperanza had already decided something on that ship. If the gods of men demanded sacrifice, she would become the flame. Greyfield Estate was not a home. It was an engine, a living structure built on fear, ritual, and hierarchy. Every brick was mortared with obedience. Every window watched someone suffer. When Esperanza arrived there, the year was 1701. Edmund Greyfield stood waiting, a man who saw himself as civilization incarnate. 6 feet tall, pale eyes like diluted ice, wearing the polished mask of Christian virtue. His smile was studied, but his eyes held that familiar emptiness, the gaze of a man who had never been told no. He renamed her Esperanza de Lima after the Portuguese port where her ship had docked, though she never told him that the name, in her tongue, meant hope born of ashes. Her first lesson came quickly. The older house slave, Sarah, spilled wine on the imported English carpet. Greyfield killed her in front of everyone, methodically, without rage, not as punishment, but as theater, a demonstration, a reminder that control required spectacle. Esperanza didn't flinch. She memorized every movement, every word, because she understood what most never see. Power performs itself. It must be witnessed to exist. Over the next 15 years, she became indispensable. She learned to move like a whisper, to anticipate Greyfield's moods, to serve the Rice Council's gatherings without ever being seen. She studied their language, their laughter, their drunken boasts. She learned their habits, the way each man's cruelty revealed his private fear. She watched them argue over rice prices, while discussing the mutilation of slaves with the same tone one might use to debate weather. She saw how they concealed their evil behind etiquette, calling torture discipline, rape, breeding, murder, correction. But beneath every system of oppression lies the same weakness, the belief in permanence. The Rice Council believed themselves untouchable, lords of a miniature kingdom, beyond the reach of consequence. So Esperanza became invisible, a shadow that served and listened, a ghost that poured their wine and absorbed their secrets. She remembered names, dates, patterns, every insult, every scream, every drop of blood spilled on Greyfield's soil. 15 years. 15 years of silence. 15 years of collecting the raw material of vengeance. And on every moonless night, when the house slept, she would whisper a phrase in the darkness, a promise to the dead who had no graves. They will burn by the same fire they used to forge their chains. By the time she turned 35, Esperanza had become part of the architecture of Greyfield Estate. When the great men of the Rice Council arrived, she was simply there, pouring the wine, setting the table, the quiet rhythm of service that allowed power to perform itself without friction. They stopped seeing her as a person years ago. That was their first mistake. The second was that they spoke freely in front of her. Men who believed they were gods rarely guarded their words around those they called property. So she listened. Every whisper, every secret ledger, every shipment that came through the port under false names. And she began to understand something larger than cruelty, a network. These men weren't just plantation owners. They were engineers of a system that reached back to London, Lisbon, and Rome. A system that moved sugar, rum, and flesh like pieces on a game board. Slavery was only the visible part. Beneath it lay the deeper machinery, control of belief. They used sermons, laws, and imported science to build a mythology that justified their world. Esperanza saw that the Rice Council didn't merely own people, they owned reality. And she started to learn their rituals, how they kept their circle bound. The meetings were more than business, they were initiations, toasts to unseen powers, oaths sworn over blood diluted in rum, symbols carved into the wood of Greyfield's dining table. They believed these gestures made them untouchable. But every system of control contains its own collapse. Esperanza began to feed the decay. A misplaced document here, a rumor there. She let small contradictions grow between the council members, jealousy sprouting like mold in the damp walls of Greyfield. She studied not just their power, but their paranoia. By the 15th year, the cracks were visible. The plantation's profits faltered. One man accused another of theft. Another fell ill after a banquet. Nothing that could be traced, nothing that could be proven. Only the quiet erosion of certainty. Esperanza had learned what her captors never would. You don't fight monsters head-on. You let them doubt each other first. You let them imagine the curse before it ever arrives. And somewhere, deep beneath her calm exterior, she began to hum that lullaby again. Not for comfort this time, but as a countdown. At first it was only a feeling. The overseers started talking about the air, how it felt heavy, how the furnace never seemed to cool. The dogs barked at empty corners of the yard. Lamps sputtered for no reason. Glass sweating black soot. Esperanza never spoke of any of it. She kept her rhythm: cook, serve, clean, disappear. But she changed tiny things. The placement of salt on the table, the order of the dishes, the sound of her footsteps on the stairs. She understood that haunting begins with misdirection. When the mind can't find its pattern, it invents one. Within weeks, the Rice Council began to meet less often. Some claimed illness, others bad luck. A shipment lost at sea, a wife miscarrying, a fever that refused to break. The men blamed weather, providence, anything but themselves. Esperanza watched their certainty drain away cup by cup. At night, she walked the corridors of Greyfield and listened. The house had begun to talk back. Beams groaned, floors whispered, the furnace breathed. She learned its voice, the rhythm of coal collapsing into ash. She timed her own breathing to it until she could feel the pulse of heat behind the walls like a second heart. She began to leave small messages no one could trace. A faint mark on the ledger of accounts, a phrase in Portuguese carved beneath the dining table, a single coal left on the governor's letter. Nothing large enough to accuse anyone of witchcraft, but enough to make the men look at one another differently, to wonder who among them had broken faith. What they never realized was that Esperanza didn't need to curse them. All she had to do was let their own guilt do the work. By the spring of 1716, Greyfield was a house divided. The furnace burned hotter, the wine soured quicker. The air itself seemed to thicken with unease. The council that once spoke with one voice now argued in whispers. Esperanza served the M as always, eyes lowered, voice quiet. Yet in her silence there was the faintest trace of a smile, because the ghosts they feared weren't outside. They were inside, every one of them, and she had simply taught them to listen. In early June of 1716, Edmund Greyfield sent out his usual invitations, hand-inked letters sealed with the emblem of the Rice Council, a sheaf of grain encircling a crown. The words were routine. Quarterly meeting, Greyfield Estate, June 23rd. Attendance required. But this time, the letters felt different. Several of the men hesitated to reply. One had lost a son to fever, another complained of a spreading sickness among his workers. Yet each one knew the rule. To miss a council meeting was to invite suspicion. The machine they had built ran on trust and fear in equal measure, and neither could afford to falter. Esperanza watched Greyfield dictate those letters. She polished the seal, heated the wax, carried the messages herself to the courier. She never altered a word. She didn't need to. Every invitation was already a summons to judgment. In the weeks before the meeting, she began preparing the house. The kitchen gleamed, the floors shone like glass. To the overseers, it looked like devotion. In truth, it was camouflage. Each stroke of her hand measured distance and timing, the placement of doors, the weight of keys. She mapped the estate like a battlefield. Angles, sounds, shadows. At night, she listened through the cracks of the walls as Greyfield spoke to himself. His voice had changed, less command, more worry. He had started reading scripture aloud, as if the words themselves could protect him. Esperanza learned them too, repeating each line in a whisper, until the verses twisted, turning prayers into prophecies. The day before the council arrived, she stood in the kitchen beside the coal furnace. The metal skin of it glowed dull red, breathing heat through the floor. She placed her palm against it and felt the vibration, not of anger, but of inevitability. Everything she had witnessed, every cruelty endured, had converged on this single pulse of heat. When Dar-1 came, the estate stirred like an animal sensing a storm. Carriages rolled up the drive, wheels cutting through mud, horses shuddering under the weight of powdered men in lace and arrogance. Esperanza opened the doors for each of them, eyes steady, voice even. None of them noticed that she no longer looked afraid. That afternoon, the Rice Council would meet for the last time. The afternoon sun pressed down like a hand, flattening every sound but the drumming of insects. Inside Greyfield, the air stood still. The 14 men filed into the dining room one by one, silver buckles flashing, laughter forced, voices too loud. Power always announces itself when it starts to crack. Esperanza moved among them like a rhythm they no longer noticed. She filled glasses, set platters, replaced candles that guttered in the heat. Her eyes caught details, how William Peyton's hands trembled when he reached for his drink, how Marcus Sutton's gaze lingered too long on the door, how Greyfield himself kept glancing toward the furnace room as if afraid to hear it breathe. The meeting began with talk of rice tariffs, ship delays, and new regulations from London. But the words felt brittle. Accusations hid behind every polite phrase. When one man mentioned a missing shipment of rum, another coughed a denial. The air turned sour with suspicion. Esperanza listened, silent, her mind recording every fracture. She had seeded all of it, months of small distortions, misfiled ledgers, whispered rumors. Now they were blooming. These men, who had built an empire on controlling other minds, were beginning to lose control of their own. When she poured the next round of rum, she spoke for the first time all day. "The coal burns hot, sirs. Shall I damp it?" Greyfield waved her off too quickly. "Leave it. Let it burn." His voice cracked on the last word. Several of the men turned to look at him, surprised. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon. Esperanza walked back to the kitchen and stood before the furnace. She didn't touch it this time. She only watched the shimmer of air above it, the mirage of heat that bent the room like a vision. In that wavering haze, she saw every face she'd served, every scream swallowed by obedience. She understood then that vengeance was only half the work. The other half was revelation. These men had to see what they had built. They had to look into the heart of the thing they called civilization and recognize their own reflection. She turned back toward the dining room, the low hum of her lullaby following her like a shadow. The final act had begun. The meeting dissolved into fragments. One man argued about taxes. Another muttered about God's punishment. Two more whispered near the window, their words too sharp for courtesy. The candles guttered, though no wind stirred. A bead of wax slid down a brass holder, pooling like blood at the base. Esperanza refilled glasses no one asked for. She moved slowly now, giving the room time to unravel itself. Every sound had weight, the scrape of a chair, the tick of the clock, the furnace sighing through the floorboards. The men tried to speak over those sounds, but the rhythm of the house was louder than they were. Greyfield struck the table with his hand. "Enough. We are not children frightened by superstition. This estate stands on reason, not ghosts." He was looking at her when he said it. She met his eyes for the first time in 15 years, not with defiance, not even anger, just recognition. "Of course, sir," she said softly. "Reason built this place." The words were plain, but something in them made the room still. A few of the men shifted, as though expecting more. None came. Esperanza turned away, and in that movement she let silence do the rest. Because silence, she knew, was the oldest instrument of power. The same tool they had used to keep others voiceless could unmake them when turned around. The clock ticked on. The air grew hotter. Sweat beaded at the collars of their fine coats. Someone cursed the heat, but no one rose to open a window. No one wanted to move first. Esperanza stood near the doorway, the hum of her lullaby barely audible, just a thread of sound weaving through the tension. It was not magic. It was memory, returning to fill the room. Every echo of suffering the walls had absorbed now pressed outward, reshaping the air. She didn't have to do anything more. The house itself was remembering. By dusk, the Rice Council's meeting had become a vigil of silence, 14 men surrounded by the weight of their own history, and one woman standing among them, unseen no longer. Night came without wind. The air outside the plantation had gone perfectly still, as if even the trees were listening. Inside, the candles burned too low, their lights stretched and trembling. The men of the Rice Council sat rigid around the table, faces half in shadow. Esperanza moved between them one last time. The routine of service continued, pour, step, bow, withdraw, but the rhythm was different now, deliberate, ceremonial. Each gesture felt like a closing act in a long ritual that none of them understood, but all of them had summoned. Greyfield tried to begin a prayer. His voice shook halfway through the first line, and he stopped. The sound of the furnace below answered him, a low, steady pulse rising through the floorboards. No one spoke after that. The silence held. Esperanza's thoughts were clear. She had spent 15 years inside this house learning the mathematics of cruelty, how power multiplied through fear, how silence became inheritance. Tonight she offered them the same mirror they had given the world, nothing supernatural, only reflection. She began to speak, her voice quiet but even. She told them what she remembered. Names, dates, places, the children taken, the women sold, the men broken in the fields. She recited it like scripture, without accusation or plea. Each word landed like a tolling bell. Some of the men protested, others begged for her to stop, but she continued, and as she spoke, the house seemed to echo the sound, a rhythm that belonged to more than one voice. The walls answered, the beams answered, the air itself carried memory. When she finished, she said only, "You taught the world how to forget. I came to teach it how to remember." The furnace roared below, its light trembling through the cracks in the floor. It was not vengeance she felt, but release, a weight leaving the air after centuries of holding its breath. Outside, through a pour, and rolled over the horizon, the first storm in months. Inside, Greyfield buried his face in his hands. The others sat in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes. Whatever power they had believed in, it was gone now, burned away by the truth of their own making. Esperanza turned and left the room. Behind her, the house creaked, settling into its new silence. Greyfield Estate would never host another meeting. Morning came shrouded in mist. The storm had passed, leaving the fields slick with silver dew. From the road, Greyfield Estate looked unchanged, columns intact, smoke curling lazily from the chimneys. But those who lived nearby said the air felt different, as though something vast had exhaled during the night. The servants found the dining room empty. The chairs were pushed back, candles burned down to stubs. No trace of the Rice Council remained. No shouts, no struggle, not even spilled wine. Only the faint smell of salt and iron, and a thin line of ash along the floorboards where the light had fallen. Esperanza was gone. Some claimed they saw her walking down the marsh road before dawn, carrying nothing but a linen bundle and humming under her breath. Others said she had vanished altogether, taken by the spirits she had awakened. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Weeks later, rumors reached the neighboring parishes. The Rice Council had dissolved, their lands divided, their families scattering to the cities. No one spoke of Greyfield again. The estate was left to ruin, its shutters banging loose in the wind, its fields reclaimed by wild grass. Years passed. The legend grew. Travelers spoke of a woman's voice heard near the old well at night, a lullaby that rose with the mist. Some said she was a warning, others a guardian. In every telling, the story changed, but one truth remained constant. Esperanza did not die at Greyfield. Greyfield died of her. And if you walk the old road at dusk, you can still feel it, the silence she left behind. Not absence. Memory, Part 2. After a century of silence, Greyfield Estate returned to human hands. The deed passed to Elias Greyfield, grandson of Edmund's younger brother, a London solicitor who had never seen the Low Country marshes but inherited their ghosts all the same. He arrived with plans for restoration, sketches of new verandas, lists of imported marble, the certainty of a man who believed history could be repaired with paint. But the moment his carriage turned off the main road, the world narrowed. The air grew heavy again, the same breathless stillness that had once filled every inch of the estate. Moss had swallowed the gates. The rice fields had turned to shallow ponds where herons stood motionless, white as bone. Locals refused to go near after dusk. They warned him, politely, that the house kept its own hours. He laughed at the superstition until the first night when he heard singing. A woman's voice, low and even, threading through the corridors where no one should have been. The same melody, over and over. A lullaby. Elias followed the sound to the old dining hall. The walls were scarred with age, but along the floor, a faint line of ash still marked the outline of a vanished table. The song faded as he entered, leaving only the echo of his own breath. He tried to tell himself it was imagination, but on the mantel where no dust had gathered lay a single coal, cold but unburned. By the second week, Elias had convinced himself the singing was a dream. He told his foreman as much in the clipped tone of a man insisting on reason, but reason bends easily in an empty house, especially one that listens. He began cataloguing the estate's remnants, crates of ledgers, sealed drawers, stacks of correspondence warped by humidity. Most were routine, crop reports, debts, inventories. Then he found a smaller book, wrapped in linen, kept apart from the rest. It wasn't written in one hand, but many, different inks, styles, and dates, a ledger of names. Some crossed out, some marked with a single word, sold. At the back, a page written in a thin, almost delicate script, different from the rest. It read, "The account remains open until memory is settled." No signature, no date, only the faint outline of a coal mark on the edge of the page. That night, Elias dreamed of water. A vast marsh stretching in every direction, the horizon drowned in mist. He heard the same song again, closer now, sung by a voice neither young nor old, full of quiet resolve. When he woke, his sheets smelled faintly of smoke. He told himself it was the damp air, the residue of the old furnace below the floor. But when he returned to the dining room the next morning, the outline of ash had changed, no longer a straight line, but a circle. Elias began writing letters, not to friends, he had few, but to Dr. Miriam Alcott, a historian at the Charleston Lyceum. He had met her once in London at a lecture on colonial trade networks. She was precise, skeptical, and disarmingly direct, the kind of scholar who believed the past could be tamed by cataloguing it. He wrote to her first about the ledgers, describing their strange preservation, the multiplicity of handwriting. He did not mention the voice. He wanted her curiosity, not her concern. A fortnight later, her reply arrived, polite but urgent. If the documents are authentic, they may be the only surviving record of the Rice Council's activities. Do not alter or discard anything. The ledgers could explain much about how this region was truly governed. He smiled at that, how it was truly governed. She meant the economics, the policy, the material evidence. She did not yet understand that governance could leave a weight in the air. Still, her interest steadied him. He began to sort the papers at night, transcribing the more legible pages by candlelight. Each evening, the same faint scent of smoke. Sometimes when the candle flickered, the ink seemed to darken, as if the letters themselves were breathing. In one of the ledgers, he found a list of council members dated June 1716, 14 names, every one of them marked with a small cross beside it written later by another hand. Below them, in the margin, a single addition, Esperanza de Lima, witness. He stared at the word witness for a long time. The air in the room seemed to tilt slightly, a pressure he couldn't name. Somewhere deep in the house, the faint hum of that same lullaby stirred again, just beneath hearing, steady, patient, unending. That night, Elias wrote to Dr. Alcott again. I believe there was someone else here. Not a servant, not a victim, but a recorder. Someone who watched everything and refused to let it be forgotten. He sealed the letter quickly, though the words lingered in his mind long after. Outside, thunder rolled over the marshes, the same direction it had come from a century ago. Dr. Miriam Alcott arrived 2 days later in the heat of early August. The road to Greyfield was little more than a narrow path through the lowlands, bordered by blackwater creeks that shimmered like mirrors of tar. Her carriage wheels sank into the mud, the horses protesting with each pull. When she finally saw the house rising through the cypress trees, its roof bowed, its windows blind with dust, she felt an odd pressure in her chest, a sense of having come not to study, but to trespass. Elias met her at the gate. He looked thinner than she remembered, his clothes too loose, his eyes alight with sleepless energy. "You came," he said, almost relieved. "I wasn't sure the letter would find you." Inside, the house smelled of coal and something faintly metallic. Miriam brushed her hand across the nearest wall. Her fingers came away black. "You've been burning something?" she asked. He hesitated. "Just to keep the damp out," he said, but she noticed the hearth was cold. They set up in what had once been a study, books toppled on their sides, a cracked globe in the corner, and on the desk, the ledgers. Elias opened one carefully, showing her the faded handwriting, the signatures, the seals. "They're real," she murmured, tracing the edge of a name. "The Rice Council. Every one of them." Then she saw the final entry, the word witness beside a name she didn't recognize. "Esperanza de Lima," she read aloud. Who was she? Elias looked at her and for a long moment didn't answer. Then softly, "I think she's why the house is still here." That night, they worked by candlelight. The ink bled under their fingers, the paper dry as bone. Miriam felt a strange vibration when she turned the pages, as if the words themselves were resisting their touch. At one point, Elias froze, staring into the darkened doorway behind her. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She hadn't. But the lows, okay on his face, half awe, half terror, made her turn anyway. Nothing. Just the slow crack of settling wood. Yet when she turned back, the candle flame had doubled, stretching tall and thin, 2 tongues of light moving together like breath. And somewhere, impossibly faint, the echo of a woman's voice seemed to murmur through the smoke. Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete. By dawn, the humidity had turned the air into something you could almost drink. The candles had burned themselves into pools of wax, but Elias and Miriam kept working, driven not by curiosity anymore, but by compulsion. The newest ledger they uncovered wasn't like the others. The handwriting changed midway through. Gone were the clipped, arrogant flourishes of the planters. The second half was written in a steadier, more deliberate hand, one that seemed to listen as much as it spoke. Miriam leaned closer. "This isn't a record of transactions," she said. "It's a testimony." Elias nodded slowly. "But whose?" She turned the page. There in the margin, a signature repeated 3 times, as if the writer had been testing the weight of her own name. Esperanza de Lima. The first entry was dated June 22nd, 1716, the day before the council meeting. "They think I do not understand their language. They think my silence is ignorance, but silence is study. Every word they speak becomes a brick in the furnace I am building. Every cruelty is another piece of coal." Miriam whispered the lines aloud, her voice trembling despite herself. Elias had stopped breathing. Page after page revealed not revenge but calculation, a woman recording the rhythms of power, documenting how domination spoke, moved, and justified itself. Each entry sharper than the last, the tone of someone who understood that bearing witness was the only rebellion that could not be silenced. But as they translated, something strange began to happen. The ink on the page appeared fresher than before, glistening faintly under the morning light. Words they hadn't noticed earlier seemed to emerge between the lines, as if added while they read. Miriam reached for the magnifying lens, but the letters kept shifting, like heat mirage. She blinked, and the script rearranged itself into English, clean and modern. To those Ho read this now. Your age is no different from mine. Your masters wear other clothes, but their hands are the same. You will think this story is history. It is not. It is the mirror you refuse to face. She dropped the book. Elias caught it before it hit the floor, his eyes wide. She's speaking to us, he said quietly. Not from the past, from underneath it. And for the first time, Miriam understood. This wasn't a haunting, it was an invitation.